No, it's definitely an honor and a privilege to introduce to you my dad, Vernon Lloyd, and his wife, Lena Lloyd. If you guys can come on up here. I'll just tell you this is, if it's the difference between my dad and me is, one, you have to fight me to get the microphone away. He usually don't want it, but when he came and said, I want to share my testimony, I was like, man, I know it's a God thing, so I'm really excited. I'm excited that you guys are here to hear it. It's not by accident that you're here, so can we give him another round of applause?
Thank you. I'm Vernon. My name's Vernon. When he sat down over there at that piano, it scared me so bad I can't hardly remember anything I had to say. I was going to find out where's the nearest back door. Well, my name is, like I said, Vernon Lloyd. This is my beautiful wife, Lena, not one of my daughters. This is my wife. I robbed the cradle. But she's only a few years younger than me. Let me admit that. And is that right? I was born and raised in that little flat top house right over there. And my dad over here built the house. And it started as a one-bedroom. Then he built 2 more bedrooms in the back. And I'm glad that he's here today with Aiden and Jimmy, and there's 4 generations of Lloyd boys here in this building. It's a wonder the walls are still standing with pranks and jokes and tricks being played. But I remember the house right over there that used to be the parsonage. That's where I thought at the time of when I was 6 years old was the home of the love of my life, Claudia Holland. She was the pastor's daughter. And we had that love-hate relationship. I loved her. She hated me. And then down the street, I got myself in a little bit of trouble. There was all dirt roads back in those days. And me and Brent McManus and Bumpy Osteen and some of the other guys that lived in the area, we got this idea that this fella named Eddie had a little motorbike. He'd come by about 4:30 every day, and we thought, well, we're going to just bury a rope on the road, and when he started coming along, we were going to yank the rope. Well, we did that, and when we yanked the rope, it threw Eddie off, and I didn't realize how big Eddie was until you have him chasing you down the street. He was a very angry guy, but you confess your sins and God will forgive you, and it's always best to let people know. I was riding my bicycle down 30th Street, turned left, and was headed to 29th and go around the block, and Bumpy's house was right on the other end of the block. He had this white German Shepherd, and I was scared to death of dogs, but I knew they always kept Bumpy's dog in the fence. So and Bumpy and a bunch of the other boys were out there playing and wrestling like boys do. And I turned a corner, and I got halfway down, and there's Bumpy's dog out of the fence. And he starts chasing me. And I kept thinking, I should have said, God, help me, God, help me. And please go out, please, God, help us. All I could think of saying was, Mama! And I started screaming that. And Bumpy and Brant and the others just started rolling around laughing on the thing, on the grass. And that's my memories of this area. But I remember this church years ago with singing on Sunday night. You could hear them singing from our house, beautiful songs, and going to vacation Bible school here in the summertime. But it brings back a lot of memories driving down the street. But I have a special memory I want to testify to you about. But first, a lot of it I can't remember. And I was out of it for so long. But my wife here, Lena, she and my children and my family, the rest of my family, bore the brunt of it all. And they're the ones that had to suffer. I really didn't know a lot what was going on. So, Lena, if you would explain what was happening.
Good morning. So our story starts in mid-January of this year. Vernon woke up early Friday morning, the 15th, about 2 o'clock, with severe shoulder pain that radiated into his chest and shortness of breath. So I took him to the hospital, and of course, because of COVID, I wasn't able to go in with him. As I was walking out, I'm crying and crying because I really wanted to be with him, but I knew he had his phone, so he would call me. So I waited in the parking lot until about 3:30, and he called me and he said, "Oh, they said it's not a heart attack." Well, he totally lied, and I went home, and then the next day I called him and he said, "Oh yeah, it was a heart attack and they're admitting me." So by the time they found a room, it was later in the afternoon, and I was able to see him, and the hospital ran a series of tests over the next several days, and it was decided that he needed to have open heart surgery. He had to have a quadruple bypass, which actually turned into only a triple bypass, of which only 2 arteries were good. So he had his triple bypass on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, the 18th, which was 3 days after he was admitted. And he did pretty well. Of course, the first image I saw of him after his surgery was this. We're not allowed to take pictures, but I did anyway. And you can see all the machines up there, and I based my understanding of his healing or non-healing on how many machines he was hooked up to at any given time. How many were added, how many were taken away. But this was probably 3 hours after he got out of surgery. The next day, he woke up and he was kidding around with the doctor. Apparently, during his surgery, Jason Momoa was chasing him around the hospital, blocking all the exits so that he couldn't get out. He's a big guy, I guess. That's him. And so he was joking with the doctor, and I was very encouraged because that's Vern's natural state, is joking around and kidding around and telling stories. So things were moving along pretty well. This next picture is a picture of him 2 days after his surgery, and you can see he's pretty alert, pretty awake. What we didn't know at the time was that when he was admitted to the hospital, his A1C, his kidney functions were at a 12. For somebody who's diabetic, that's pretty high. And so his kidneys started to shut down and were not filtering all the drugs and everything that was in his system. So he kind of went downhill from there. He was transferred up to the 5th floor, and this next video is the day that he was transferred, and he was just very loopy and out of it, but it was a moment of levity for both of us because we kind of needed that at that point. Vernon. Hi.
Hey,
Are you tired? Yeah. Where are we right now?
Jim Farm.
We're at a jungle farm? What's that? Oh, baby. Vernon. I'm kissing him. Hey. Vernon. Hi.
Hi,
Where are we right now?
you're in this jungle farm.
We're at Lloyd's jungle farm? Oh, okay. Mm-hmm. So you can see he was very drugged up, doped up. Things were not coming out of his system. And that day he was transferred up to the 5th floor. And in quick succession, he had 2 seizures right in front of me. So they decided, let's bring him back down to CVICU. So they did do that. And he stayed there for the next 8 days, I believe. The second day he was in CVICU, he had a BiPAP machine on because he had pneumonia, and he pulled it off, and he coded. So the nurses and the therapists came running, and they were able to resuscitate him and get him back. But they said that it was pretty bad because his nail beds were blue, he was blue, and he was brought back. And if that isn't prayer and God guiding nurses and everybody's hands, then I don't know what is. 7 days after that, he was transferred to a rehab in Fort Pierce, and 3 days after that, I got a call saying that he was on his way to Longwood because they found him unresponsive. He had had a stroke, and I'm one of these people who I need to see something. I need some tangible proof of something to understand the gravity of the situation. So when they did finally get him a room up on the 5th floor after his visit to the emergency room after his stroke, I gave him a kiss and I went over to the counter in the sink, and I was fluttering around with stuff, and his clothes were on the counter. And I reached for his yellow Guy Harvey shirt, and when I picked it up, I opened it, and it opened in one big piece. So I realized that what they had to do was to cut the shirt open so they could access his chest and do the chest compressions and all the things that brought him back. So that was his second coding and his last. So he stayed in the hospital for 8 more days. So he was in the hospital itself for a total of a month. And then he was transferred to another rehab in Port St. Lucie with the idea that we were all going to be able to go in to see him. And that wasn't the case. They canceled all of the visits from any family members the day before he went in because due to COVID. So when he went into rehab, he was doing okay. He was moving around. They were getting him up. He was having some issues with his blood pressure, but he seemed to be doing okay. And then he got COVID. But thankfully, and because of prayer, people who didn't know us, people who did know us, he came through that, and he was able to come home to us after a total of 8 weeks in hospital and rehab. I don't know if you have the last picture. Yeah, that's him the day he came home on March 10th. He was so happy because he kept saying, I really want to go home, I really want to go home, but they couldn't let him go home if he couldn't walk. And that's a huge thing for somebody who's been through open heart surgery and somebody who's been through everything that Vern went through. And luckily I had a job where I was able to work from home and be with him. So we had a lot of visits from nurses and therapists, and he would take little walks. The first times he went out, he went to the mailbox and back, and that exhausted him. And then he went to the left end of our street, which was a very short way, and that exhausted him. But he kept moving further and further every day. And after about a month, he was able to walk about a mile. Our road is 1 mile if you walk up and down it once and through all the cutouts. So he was able to do that after a month at home. I can't tell you when a loved one gets sick, especially a spouse, there's a feeling of isolation for the other spouse. I felt hopeless a lot of the time. Like it was up and down. And yes, he would get better, and no, he wouldn't. Yes, he would. No, he wouldn't. But I really believe that because people were praying for us, God shined his grace on me, and there really was light in the darkness, and for Vern too. So now he walks 1 mile to 2 miles almost every day. His A1C is down to 7. His blood sugar, he's watching because he's wearing a device that the doctor gave him, which has been a game changer. He has a defibrillator in, which they check his heart. And he's doing a lot better than he was before he ever went into the hospital. He won't ever be 100% again, but he will be the best that he can be at this point in time. And I'm just so gratified to everyone who prayed for us, and those we knew and those we didn't, that God saved my best friend.
And so the situation with Jason Momoa was that I had had enough, and I had my hospital gown on, and I walked out to the nurse's station. I got out there, and I said, "Look, I'm going home." And they said, "No, you can't go home. You can't walk very well." And I said, "I'm going home." And I started to walk, and the big, hefty nurse that was sitting behind the desk said, "Get him." And I looked around to see who was going to get me, and it was Jason Momoa. I ran got to the elevator. The elevator door opened up, and there he was inside the elevator. I ran down the stairs, ran out the door, and hailed a taxi, and guess who was a taxi driver? You're right, Jason Momoa. But everything has turned out so well for me, and God has done such a wonderful thing for me, but I wish he would kind of erase that Jason Momoa thing from my mind, because when I see him on television, it's worse than watching Halloween or Halloween 2 or any kind of thing. He comes on, and it scares me. But during this time, one evening, I guess I had a near-death experience in which I found myself walking down a dark black hallway. There were just little lights along the bottom of the hall so you could see where to walk, kind of like they have in movie theaters. And I was walking down the long hallway, and I get to the end, and it comes to a huge waiting room. And the room had no windows, no pictures. I could see no doors. And all that I could see, there were chairs lined up along all 3 major walls, and people sitting in it, more or less older folks like me with gray hair, some a little younger and some very small. And I saw that they were all just sitting there with solemn looks on their faces, and I went over. I saw 3 chairs over here, and I walked over to the chairs and sat down. A few minutes, a speaker comes out and calls the name of a man, and a man stands up, and a wall slides, or a sliding door slides open, and the man walks through it, and the door closes behind it. And a few minutes later, I call a woman's name, and the same thing happens over here. It slides open, and then she goes through it, and it closes. After a little while, my name was called, and I look over, and this area opens up, and I walk through it, and it closes behind me. When I walk through it, I see that I'm on the outside of a building, and there's a hedge, a tall hedge, over to my left, and over to my right is a fountain, kind of looked like a huge bird bath. And so I was thinking, wonder what's on the other side of the hedge. And I walk until I get to the end of the hedge, and on that side of the hedge, there was this beautiful river just flowing. And I remember back when I was a little kid in church, we would sing about a river flowing deep and wide, and do our hands and the motions. And the river was just gorgeous. It was just so beautiful and clear. And then the beach started up, and it was snow white sand, and it had a sparkle to it. And I reached down, and it was actually a beach that, or the sand was crushed, and it was like crystal, little tiny pieces of crystal. And I was amazed. And then when the beach, where the beach stopped, it started with a gorgeous landscaped area, big, large, like a golf course or whatever, and trees throughout. And around the trees were plants that were so beautiful. And I said all that because the colors of the trees and the grass and the plants were so vivid. And I had never dreamed in color or never thought of color before. And it was always black and white. But there was the most beautiful blues and the yellows and greens and reds. And I happened to notice, and I looked far down the beach, and there were two ladies coming towards me. And they were waving their arms, and they were smiling. And they had on green dresses, and their dresses were flowing softly in the breeze. And as they got closer to me, they both had big smiles on their faces. And when they got close enough, I recognized the young lady on the left. Looked like my sister, Sherry, who passed away when she was 26 and I was 27 many years ago. And then I noticed the lady on my right looked like my mother. And my mother didn't laugh and smile an awful lot, but this lady, being my mother, had such a beautiful smile and laughing and waving. And when they got to me, they hugged me deeply, and we cried a little bit. And they said, "Come, go with us. Go with us. We want to show you something." And as I was walking up the beach with them, I noticed laying in the sand closer towards where the grass area was a lifeless figure. And standing above both of this figure was two huge beings. All I could say is they must have been angels. They didn't have wings, but they were tall, at least 8 feet tall, and had broad shoulders at least 3 feet wide. And they were in white uniforms, and they were so distinguished. And the one at the head of the body went down on one knee and started chest compressions on his chest. And the other one stood there with solemn look at what was going on. And my mom's noticing that I was disturbed by what I was seeing because that person laying there looked like me. She said, "Don't worry about it. Don't worry about that. Nothing's probably going to happen." And so we walked on up the way, and we came to another, like a pathway, a wide pathway that had a rope going across it. And there stood a third being, like an angel, real tall, with a big smile on his face. And he saw us coming, and he reached and lifted the rope and moved around to let us go through. But I stopped and I looked, and to my left there were beautiful, beautiful plants and all, but there were picnic tables lined as far as I could see. And people sitting at these picnic tables laughing and being so happy and joyous and drinking and eating. And on the other side of the walkway was like banquet tables with food, with pies, with cakes and food and pies, and even more pies. There was just a lot of pies. And I thought, wow, I like pie. And I looked over at the people, and there was when I was 5 years old, my Sunday school teacher was Sister Peterson. Her name was Jorlyn Peterson, and I looked, and there she sat at the picnic table, smiling, which she never smiled the whole time. We were always scared to death of her. And she was there smiling, and my old pastor that used to pick me up right here on the corner and let me ride his school bus, C.M. Harris, he was there laughing and talking. Of course, he couldn't sit still. He had to run around, pat everybody on the back, and talk to them. And another pastor, and then there was Cecil Hazeleaf, who was a man that, an older man that was like one of the seniors of our church when I was small, with his snow white hair and his little flat top hat, or flat top haircut. And he was running around. Everybody was just having such a great time. But I turned and I noticed that one of the original angels had come over and had leaned over to my mother's ear and whispered, and then turned and walked away. And she said to me, "Vernon, I'm sorry, but you're not going to be able to go in now." She said, "God's not through with you yet, and he still has work for you to do." And so the angel kind of moved. They walked around him and went on in and started enjoying the things inside. But there was a man that had gotten up and stepped across the bench and was walking with an empty tea glass, and he had seen me, and he yelled at me, "Hey, boy." And I looked at him, and it was Mr. Hinton, who I had known since childhood, and he was a jokester and all, and he pointed to the glass and asked if I wanted one, and I started to shake my head, yes, but that's when I noticed the angel. And when he saw that I wasn't going to get to go in, he kind of shrugged his shoulders and said, "Well, we'll see you later." And I turned and I walked back up the beach by myself, and I can remember I never felt so much sadness or so much aloneness as ever, and it was so real. And as I was walking up, a hand come and touched my hand. Didn't grab my hand, didn't hold my hand or grab my arm, just put the hand on top of mine. And I turned and looked, and it was Lena. And she walked back with me, and I took that she was walking back to my life again. And I often had thought and remembered so much that God isn't finished with me yet, and my work here is not done. And that has immensely affected me, and that I think now that if you're a Christian and you're still here, that God's work for you is not done yet. He's not finished with you yet. And from what I have seen, there's such joy and happiness waiting for you on the other side. And no matter how long it gets, no matter how far away it might be, the fact and knowing when you're under pressure and when things are not going so well for you, you've got that waiting for you over there. And it helps my day be much better. And then what I had talked to Lena about it. I woke up, I was in tears, and my hospital gown was soaking wet. And one of my friends at work, a good Christian lady, had called me, and I told her about that. And she asked me if she could tell her husband. And a few minutes later, her husband calls and wanted to know if I could tell Kenny. And Kenny is Kenny Hinton, the son of the man that stepped across the table and asked me for a glass of tea. And he started, and I told him my story, and he started sobbing and crying. And what had happened is his father had passed away, and his father had never told them that he had given his heart to God. He had attended functions that weren't church services. He had helped the church and helped them with landscaping and all that, but he had never really told them that he had given his heart to God. And he had asked God to please give him some kind of reasoning or proof that this had happened, and that he was taking it that my story was his answer to prayer. A few weeks later, I had to go in for surgery for my defibrillator, which is also a pacemaker. And I was in the pre-op waiting to go into surgery, and they wheeled a couple other patients there waiting. And one was an older lady that had been a nurse and retired, and she was very ill. She had had cancer, she had had heart troubles, and all kind of problems. But she was going to have this procedure done, or she was for sure going to pass away, going to die. And I saw the nurses talking to her and everything. But then they wheeled me in, and I woke up the next day, and I noticed that the nurses coming into my room and all were not the jovial that I had known for 8 weeks prior type of nurses. And this one nurse, this older nurse, came walking in, and they were putting their arms around her and trying to make her feel better and all. And it just impressed me. I don't know if you've ever had that feeling, but impressed me to say something that it wasn't usual for me to say. And I'm not usual for taking chances like that. But I told the nurse my story, and she walked out of the room. And I thought, well, it didn't work so well. But the next day, the doctor had told me that I could go home. And it seemed funny because they said I could go on down, and my wife was waiting for me downstairs, but they didn't bring a wheelchair or anything like that. They're just going to let me walk down the hallway and walk myself out of the hospital. I guess Jason Momoa was off that day. And I got right before the elevator, and I hear, "Mr. Lloyd." And I turned around, and there is that older nurse. She came walking down the hall and told me what a blessing it had been to hear my story, and that the older nurse that had surgery, that she didn't make it, and she had passed away, and that her story made her feel much better. The story and knowing where she was and what she was doing and all that. Well, that was 2 opportunities right there. I was able to help somebody, I feel like, and I feel like God used me. But I also, like Lena said, I want to thank you for your prayers. I know this church was praying for me, along with a lot of people in this city, a lot of people in this state, and a lot of people in this country. And I just want to thank you so much and let you know that when you tell someone you're going to pray for them, mean it. As the pastor was saying a few minutes ago, you don't just say, don't make it just verbiage, because you say, I'm going to pray for you. That person that is in need is needing that prayer. And when someone tells you, I'm praying for you, believe it, because God's prayer does answer. And God has a reason for you being here and a reason for me being here. And God has a reason for us all being here today. I want to thank you.
We're so blessed to be able to do this today, because this is the first time as a couple that we were able to share our testimony in public. The story doesn't end there, and I am being called to share this with you. Living with Vern is an experience. He is very private, but he's also quite funny, and he makes me laugh every single day. We've had moments where we just laugh uncontrollably with each other, and we almost know what each other is thinking. We were not sure that he was ever going to get to go back to work, and we didn't know what that was going to look like for him physically. And we still had a fairly hefty mortgage on our house and still owed money on our cars. And through a series of extraordinary events from family and from circumstances that came out of nowhere, we were able to pay off our cars. Thank you to family for that. And we paid our house down by $30,000 since his leaving the hospital, and that was just in March. That's God working for us. And Pastor had a message up on the screen earlier about the riches that God gives you, and it's not just monetary riches, it's the people that he gives you in your life. So I just want to leave this with a kind of a funny anecdote that, Vern, he lost about 40 pounds because the first 2 weeks in the hospital he wouldn't eat. He couldn't eat. All he could do was sip Ensure. And so he grew out, his pants were like enormous on him, and his belts were all just huge. And so Vern was cleaning out his closet, and he was throwing his pants away, and he was throwing his belts away, and he handed his belts to me, which were men's size large, and said, "Here, would you like these?" But I had to laugh because that was a moment of levity. Thank you.
That was not one of my smartest moments. Like, while we're here, I just want to thank my friends, my family, and all that they've done for us, and I especially want to thank my God.